Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller and I'm here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel also. Where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Grave voices. It began with a whisper. Jacob Marsh first heard it on a cool October evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and the air turned crisp with the promise of frost. He was walking home from the grocery store, the sound of plastic bags rustling in his hands when the whispering started. It was faint at first, like wind stirring dry leaves, but it grew clearer with every step he took past the old pinewood cemetery. Jacob, he froze. His name echoed softly, carried on the breeze. He scanned the cemetery, its crooked headstones barely visible in the twilight. The hairs on his neck bristled. It was probably kids, he thought. Pinewood Cemetery had been a favorite haunt for teenagers looking to scare each other or sneak off for a smoke. But then he heard it again. Jacob, murderer. The voice was unmistakable. It was Lila's, his wife. His breath hitched and the bag slipped from his hands, cans of soup and a loaf of bread rolling onto the pavement. Lila had been dead for 3 years. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the sound of Lila's voice looping in his mind. It couldn't be real. He was tired, maybe even losing it a little. Grief did strange things to people, and though the years had dulled the pain, her absence still felt like a wound that wouldn't heal. The next day, he avoided the cemetery, taking the longer route to the grocery store. But the whispers followed him. Not just Lila's voice now, but others, dozens. Liar, thief, betrayer. Their accusations clung to him like smoke, suffocating and inescapable. By the end of the week, Jacob found himself standing at the gates of Pinewood Cemetery. A cold wind swept through the iron bars, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and decay. He stepped inside. The graveyard was eerily quiet, save for the crunch of gravel under his boots. Jacob wandered among the headstones, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The voices grew louder the deeper he went, a cacophony of whispers that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath his feet. And then he found her. Lila's grave. You killed me, Jacob. No, he muttered, shaking his head. I didn't do anything. You let me die. Tears blurred his vision. She wasn't wrong. Lila had been sick, but he'd ignored the signs. Too wrapped up in his work, too consumed by his own troubles. When she collapsed that day in the kitchen, he'd hesitated before calling for help, frozen by fear and indecision. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. I'm sorry, he whispered. The ground beneath Lila's grave began to shift. Jacob stumbled back as the earth cracked open, revealing a yawning darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolence. From the shadows emerged a skeletal hand, its bony fingers curling toward him. Jacob fled, but the cemetery didn't let him go easily. The whispers followed him home, filling every corner of his small house. Lila's voice was relentless, accusing him night after night until he thought he'd go mad. Desperate, he returned to Pinewood Cemetery with a shovel. determined to unearth the truth or bury it once and for all. He dug through the night, the cold air biting at his skin, until his shovel struck something solid, a wooden box. Inside was a collection of photographs, letters, and a small, blood-stained knife. They weren't Lila's things. They belonged to the cemetery's caretaker, a man who had gone missing decades ago. The letters revealed his obsession with death, his belief that the spirits of the dead could be harnessed and controlled. Jacob realized too late that he'd disturbed something ancient, something that should have remained buried. The next morning, the townspeople found Jacob's body sprawled across Lila's grave, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. The whispers in Pinewood Cemetery fell silent that day. But at night, when the wind blew just right, some swore they could hear a new voice among the dead. Jacob's voice, warning anyone who dared to listen. Part 2. Grave Voices. The graveyard at the edge of Whitlock was quiet most of the time. Birds perched on the crooked oak trees, and the occasional breeze stirred fallen leaves across the headstones. But for Harold Brigsby, the quiet wasn't comforting. Not since the whispers had started. Harold was a widower of 3 years, a man whose days blended into the grey of his existence. After Susan's sudden death, he found solace, or so he told himself, by visiting her grave every evening. Her headstone was simple, her name etched in clean letters. He'd sit beside it and talk to her, though he knew there'd be no reply. Until there was. It began on a Tuesday evening. The sky bruised with the coming storm. Harold was recounting his day, how the neighbor's dog had dug up his flower beds again. When he heard it, a whisper, faint as wind through grass. Harold. He froze. His hand trembled on Susan's headstone. Harold, the voice came again. It was hers, unmistakably hers. Susan, he croaked, his throat dry. No answer, but the sound of whispers grew. He turned his head toward the other graves, his eyes darting from stone to stone. The whispers weren't just from Susan's grave. They were coming from all around him. Low, insistent murmurs, like a swarm of voices trying to be heard over each other. The next evening, he returned, telling himself it had been his imagination. But as he sat, the whispers returned, louder this time. Why Harold? Why what? He whispered back, his pulse thudding. You know what? You killed me. Harold staggered back, his chair tipping over. No, that's not true. You had a stroke. The doctors said, you killed me. Panic clawed at his chest. Memories of their last fight surged forward. It had been about the money. Susan always worried about their savings. He'd yelled, stormed out, and then she was gone. But that didn't mean... Prove it! He shouted at the grave, his voice cracking. The whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. The next day, Harold couldn't stop himself. He went to the library, poring over old records and medical reports. He visited Susan's doctor, asking questions that earned him concerned glances. The more he dug, the stranger things became. He found inconsistencies in her autopsy report, strange omissions in her medical history. and the whispers followed him. Every night, they grew louder. They weren't just Susan's voice anymore. Others joined in, voices he recognized from the town. The old school teacher who died last winter, the grocer who'd passed from a heart attack. They all had secrets, sins they accused their loved ones of. The whispers spilled out tales of betrayal, murder, theft, and lies. Whitlock had always been a quiet town, but the dead had stories to tell. Harold became obsessed. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating. He began recording the whispers on an old tape recorder, playing them back during the day, analyzing every word. Susan's accusations haunted him. One night, he snapped. Armed with a shovel, he returned to the graveyard. Rain poured as he dug into the wet earth, his hands blistering, his mind fractured. He needed to know. He needed to see. When the coffin cracked open, he gasped. Susan's body was untouched, her face serene even in death. But clutched in her hand was a letter, one he hadn't put there. Trembling, he unfolded it. The letter was written in Susan's neat handwriting, and it wasn't addressed to him. It was addressed to someone named Anna. "I know about you and Harold," the letter began. "I know about the money. If you think you can kill me and get away with it, you're wrong. I'll make sure everyone knows what you did." Harold's knees buckled. Anna. She was Susan's best friend. The two of them had grown close after Susan's death. Too close. Harold had pushed the guilt aside, but now it rushed back with full force. The whispers rose again, deafening this time. "You let her kill me. You knew." "No," Harold shouted, covering his ears. "I didn't know. I didn't." But the graveyard didn't care for his excuses. The earth beneath him shifted, the mud sucking him down. He screamed as skeletal hands clawed at him, dragging him into the grave. The next morning, the graveyard was quiet again. Harold's grave sat beside Susan's, a fresh headstone gleaming in the weak sunlight. The townsfolk found his body days later, but no one could explain how he died. And at night, if you listened closely, you could hear the whispers, louder than ever. The dead weren't done talking. Not yet.